Okay. Hello and good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone, wherever you may be. It's a rainy afternoon here in Maryland on the US Eastern Seaboard. So welcome to this session organized by the Interest Group on Monitoring and Evaluation. Our topic is what research and experience tells us about environmental peacebuilding monitoring and evaluation. I am Juha Uitto, and I'm with the Global Environment Facilities Independent Evaluation Office. And it's my great pleasure to act as the moderator for this session. Let me first remind us all of the association's policy on anti-discrimination, retaliation, and harassment, which provides some ground rules to this session as well. We obviously very much welcome a lively discussion, but please remember to be respectful towards all participants, irrespective of their background and views that may differ from yours. We have a fairly packed agenda with 4 interesting presentations. So let me introduce all of the speakers now, and we can then proceed with their presentations one after another. I also suggest that we leave questions and comments till the end, so as to ensure that we will have time for a discussion and that the speakers who come later in the program will not feel squeezed. In the meantime, you can park your comments and questions in the chat, which we'll be monitoring. And during the discussion at the end, then you can either use the chat or use the microphones. I should also say, by the way, that we are recording this session, so I hope that will be all right with all of you. There will also be interpretation available, I believe. So if you are more comfortable in listening to some other language than English, so feel free to use your interpretation. So let me go through the speakers, all of them at once, before handing it over. So the first speaker is Dr. Amanda Woomer, who is a monitoring, evaluation, and learning specialist in the fields of environmental peacebuilding, conflict sensitivity, and international development. Her work focuses on how organizations and projects can craft right-sized monitoring and evaluation systems that support reflective and adaptive practice, conflict sensitivity, and multi-stakeholder accountability. She is currently my co-chair of this association's M&E interest group and has worked with organizations such as Conservation International, Columbia University's Earth Institute, the Center for Conservation Peacebuilding, and the Environmental Law Institute. After her, we'll have a joint paper by Dr. Jamin van den Hoek and Dr. Laura Peters. Jamin leads the Conflict Ecology Lab at Oregon State University, where he is an associate professor. He uses satellite imagery and other geospatial data to map human environment relationships in conflict-affected contexts with a focus on migration and displacement. Jamin was a NASA postdoctoral fellow and completed his PhD in geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Laura is a postdoctoral research fellow at University College London, cross-appointed to the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction and the Institute for Global Health. She studies how divided societies build knowledge about and act upon contemporary social environmental changes and challenges to support health, sustainability, justice, and peace. Laura is also a geographer and completed her PhD at Oregon State University. Then, after their presentation, it will be Héctor Morales Munoz, who is a doctoral research fellow at the Leibniz Center for Agricultural Landscape Research, or ZALF, and the Alliance of Biodiversity International, and CIAT, the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. His research focuses on assessing impacts and mechanisms of environmental peace-building strategies, particularly on sustainable land use systems, zero deforestation value chains, and environmental governance arrangements. He has a Master of Science in Development Studies from the London School of Economics and is currently a PhD candidate at the Humboldt Universität zu Berlin. And finally, we will have Dr. Erika Key, who has fostered monitoring and evaluation in international transdisciplinary research through the development and implementation of the Belmont Forum grant operation system and annual reporting cycle. She also supports research transparency and open data and digital objects management, integrating this into international program assessment and valorization. Erika is a former NSF National Science Foundation Program Director, Executive Director of the Belmont Forum, and is now the US Global Hub Director for Future Earth. So a very interesting panel, a very distinguished group of people here, with especially within our field of monitoring and evaluation. So, okay, enough from me. So without further ado, I'll pass the word over to Amanda. And you have 12 or 15 minutes, perhaps. I'll try to keep you on the straight and narrow.
Thanks, Juha. And thanks, Stella, for sharing the screen for me. I really appreciate that. I do see, oh, there we go. So I'm just going to start by helping us frame this conversation and thinking about how we're conceptualizing environmental peace building, but also then how we're talking about monitoring and evaluation and what findings we have from the research that we're doing with Environmental Law Institute, funded by the U.S. Institute of Peace. So first, let's just talk about what environmental peace building is. Environmental peace building are interventions that are at the intersection of peace, conflict, and the environment. Ideally, this includes both utilizing natural resources, they're managing them, as well as peace building tools together, and is conflict sensitive. And anyone that was on an earlier panel this week, I changed the wording a bit on this slide because we had a discussion about, is environmental peace building the same thing as conflict sensitivity? And it reminded me that while they may not be the same thing, ideally environmental peace building does include conflict sensitive programming. So yes, it exists at that intersection of environment, peace, and conflict. You can go to the next slide, Shella. So our project, which as I mentioned is a collaboration between the Environmental Peacebuilding Association and the Environmental Law Institute, and is funded by the United States Institute of Peace, has a number of different areas all toward the same or similar goals. And that includes a literature review, including gray literature of what's out there on environmental peace building M&E. And to be honest, it's very little. There is a lot of experience that we found through doing interviews and consultations, but there hasn't really, those things haven't really made it into the literature, which is why we've done the interviews and the consultations with a number of different people who maybe work in M&E, but also in environmental peace building programs or programs that combine environment and peace or conflict outcomes. And then we've done, which I think is a really interesting part of this work, peer learning workshops with a number of different folks where we get smaller groups together to talk about challenges that someone is facing with their team, to talk about ways that we can address those challenges, problem solve, and really brainstorm together how to work on those issues. And that ranges from things like, well, what indicators should we use, to how do we engage in a specific conflict context, and how do we be participatory? You can click ahead, Shella. This has resulted in a review, or it will result in a review article of that literature, a practitioner's toolkit that's meant to be very applied and useful to those that are doing M&E of environmental peace building, M&E professionals or not. A policy article, we're hoping to influence things like funders and how these kinds of decisions on how projects take place are made. An online platform. This is really important because we're not just trying to produce static outputs like articles and toolkits that, you know, live somewhere, are not updated, are not talked about how they're used. And this online platform will give us the place where we can all come together and think through these toolkit and articles and what's happening through a community of practice. So we have the M&E interest group of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, and that's where we want this work to continue to live and grow and have conversations on it. Just to mention the toolkit components, because I think that's one of the biggest pieces and potentially the most useful for folks, especially those that aren't M&E professionals but are doing environmental peacebuilding work. The toolkit will include sections on design, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So thinking through everything from how are we designing theories of change and our strategies, how are we developing indicators, monitoring for unintended consequences, making sure that we're participatory, doing evaluation at both the project and program level, especially using emergent evaluation approaches. And then how do we make sure that this stuff is used and we learn from it? And the learning that might happen at different scales, from the project to the institution to the larger field, and really building that evidence base. You can go to the next slide. So why is this project important? The first is that there are specific key challenges for environmental peace building. The first one is quite obvious, but it's really understanding the relationships between conflict, peace, and environmental outcomes. How do those interact with each other? How are they influencing each other in these complex and very fluid contexts or systems in which we're working? So we're moving away from, oh, I'm collecting these very static, maybe quantitative indicators of conflict or the environment, to thinking through how are these things interacting with each other. These operating environments are often very volatile, and that makes doing M&E challenging, extra challenging when we think about, especially, you know, how are we allowing people to participate or encouraging people to participate in our project? How are we getting monitoring data in these situations? Who can we ask for monitoring data, and what are the implications of that? The second reason why this project is really important is one I mentioned, but there's very limited evidence on what's working for doing M&E of environmental peace building in either the academic or the gray literature. So there isn't a lot to draw on as practitioners in developing M&E systems about what we should do or what we should avoid. And then the third piece of this is it's the beginning of a long-term collaboration, also like I mentioned, and I'm really excited for this part. Where we're forming this community of practice and starting with this toolkit and these articles as a way of continuing the conversation and ensuring that learning happens. You know, maybe there's not a lot of literature right now, but we can use this long-term community of practice and collaboration to continue to engage and learn from each other and build upon this. You can go to the next slide. So the main impetus of this is, what have we learned so far? So the first is that many of the issues that we think about when we think about M&E, those still apply to the M&E of environmental peace building, but they're often exacerbated in this context. First, accountability and participation. When we think about participation in M&E of the various different stakeholders, be they donors or people that live in the communities that we're working in or partner organizations, that's always been a challenge for M&E. It is made more challenging by working in an environmental peace building context, because by including some people at different times, whether that's design or monitoring and evaluation, you are basically influencing that context. You have to think about conflict dynamics. If I bring these people together with these people, is that going to be problematic? If I get monitoring information here and not there, is that going to mean that some people think it's not valid or reliable or not what they prioritize? We also have issues with long time horizons. Conflicts in the environment tend to change both very quickly, but also very slowly when we think about, the root causes of conflict or long-term environmental effects. Attribution and contribution. Attribution is made so much more difficult in environmental peace building context because of the dynamism and the fluidity of the situation and how many different actors are at play. And just generally the context in which we're working, it's often insecure. How do we get monitoring data if I can't go to a place or if I can't talk to certain people? That's something that we've seen come up over and over again in doing this work, is that the same problems, but they're much bigger. M&E for environmental peace building also has broad applications. You may not consider yourself an environmental peace builder, but you may find that this the work that we're doing applies to your work because you are working in similar areas. We've also seen that a lot of people are not M&E practitioners, and so we're hoping to come up with something that you don't have to be an M&E specialist to use. And then it's essential to go beyond quantitative indicators. We've talked a lot with folks in consultations or interviews about how simply focusing on quantitative indicators isn't going to get us the information we need about people's perceptions and how things are playing out in the work that we're doing. And we do know, happily, that there is a wealth of ideas and experience to draw on out there. We've had lots of conversations that have been really illuminating. It's just not well documented, and that's part of what this project seeks to answer. And then finally, this will always need to be a work in progress. I know I've said a couple of times about the ongoing engagement and the community of practice, but one thing we've learned is that there's new stuff happening all the time. There are lots of new ideas. There's more evidence emerging, so it will always be a work in progress. And I think that's it for me. Oh, wait, one more. Sorry, I forgot about this slide. What can we do very quickly? Think beyond traditional M&E approaches. Let's stop doing things the way they've always been done and think about what's really going to work in these situations. Things like outcome harvesting or most significant change that people have been talking about. Let's start leaning towards those and other innovative ways of doing M&E. Let's ground M&E in learning. Let's really root it in what we're trying to learn and how we can share that to other stakeholders, whether it's our project team or in the broader environmental peace building field. Really importantly, think of M&E as intervention, not separate from it. How we do monitoring and evaluation and learning affects the context, and we should start thinking about it as intervention. And then finally, I can't say it enough, create spaces that foster discussion and engagement among those of us that are doing this. Okay, now I think I'm finished. Thanks, Shella.
Thanks very much, and thanks for being so to the point also, so we are on track here. I think this was very clear, and I think there shouldn't be any particular questions at this stage for you, so we can move directly to Jamin and Laura, and I think it's perhaps only Jamin who is presenting today. Over to you.
Thank you, Juha. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Great. Indeed, it is just me today. Thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks, Amanda, for such a nice lead-in. I hope what we're presenting here kind of meets the standards that you've laid out. The title of our talk is Looking Through the Keyhole, a critical view on remote environmental monitoring and environmental peace building.
Actually, sorry, now your screen looks a little bit strange. You have that your presentation on top of your, yeah, now it's better. Yeah.
Thanks. So looking at these two images, our gut reaction may be that the image on the left of the serene river is almost synonymous with peace. What if, in fact, this image on the right of a polluted waterway could actually be a more efficient pathway to peace building? To understand how either example of environmental condition or their changes over time does or does not contribute to peace building, we need evidence drawing from the kind of robust environmental monitoring and engagement at the community level that Amanda was speaking about. building up this environmental evidence base, relying more on systematic assessments rather than anecdotal success stories will really help us better understand what works and how and what doesn't work in environmental peacebuilding intervention. So enhanced environmental monitoring is integral in this effort because environmental improvement may offer a pathway towards a virtuous cycle of environmental gains and peacebuilding gains that goes on even after environmental peacebuilding intervention concludes. And we need to be able to track those changes over time. So what is this virtuous cycle? Well, this is the potential, the terrific potential of environmental peacebuilding is to lead to a virtuous cycle where peacebuilding environmental gains become self-sustaining through feedback loops after an intervention concludes into perpetuity in theory. Understanding whether this potential for a virtuous cycle is real or only aspirational is really critical, since climate change may cast its own kind of virtuous cycles of environmental degradation and conflict and we need to be able to mitigate these in particular in the absence, and difficult to do so in the absence of integrative strategies. So the kind of feedback loop this very simplistic feedback loop that we've shown on the right, which doesn't talk at all about causal mechanisms or where to start the monitoring process or any of these sort of community level engagements, we don't know how often these feedback loops exist. We don't really have the means to characterize them very well, in part because of the existing lack of attention to environmental outcomes of environmental peacebuilding intervention that Amanda was just mentioning about. So without understanding these feedbacks, claims that environmental peacebuilding yields both peacebuilding and environmental gains within the self-sustaining cycle, we really can't substantiate that. So we really need to coalesce around a shared conceptualization about the role of environmental gains in environmental peacebuilding. Of course, recognizing that there are very many different ways of understanding and measuring environmental change, and not a single one being perfect or objective. So typically, we think about environmental problem, if nothing else, acting as the entry point to catalyze peacebuilding. But thinking about the virtuous cycle, that environmental change may also be necessary for sustained peace. And one of the greatest success stories we see here is the EcoPeace Middle East team in the River Jordan. After a years-long intervention of addressing water quality and quantity concerns. So the original concern here, quality and quantity, catalyzed discussions, but we don't right now. One of the focuses of our project is trying to understand how the changes in the River Jordan, for example, persisted throughout the intervention as well as following, and how those changes do or do not interact with sustained peace. Another common assumption is that peace itself leads to improved environmental outcomes. However, some of our research in Colombia shows actually that peace agreements can lead to worse environmental outcomes, precisely because institutional changes that also go along with demographic changes and policy changes and attitudinal changes can actually lead to worse environmental outcomes. So these are two graphics from some of the work led by a former PhD student of mine, Paulo Murillo Sandoval in Colombia. This is a remote sensing-based project that on the left you can see this is a map of the study area within Colombia. All of those red cells you see are areas that we saw more forest loss following the 2017 peace agreement. Most of that map is red. We call this the end of gunpoint conservation. The institution changed, the conservational values changed. And so we actually saw much more loss, and you can see that as well on the right-hand graphic of the timeline, where we see a peak in the amount what we call disturbance area, which is the amount of area of forest loss. And that peaks following the peace agreement. So kind of counterintuitive, certainly not at all what the drafters of the peace agreement intended, but there we have it. And also suffice it to say that the idea of peaceful contexts driving or leading to improved or at least neutral environmental outcomes doesn't really hold up when we think about the obvious elephant in the room of the global minority, which is to say the global north, driving global climate change and associated degradation. So the goal of environmental monitoring then is twofold. following what Amanda was saying, we want to narrow the gap between personal observations and awareness and empirical measurements, whether those are qualitative or quantitative. We also want to use environmental monitoring to establish a narrative of condition and change that helps elucidate the underpinning processes driving that change, which are both environmental as well as peace and conflict oriented. At the least, then, we establish an understanding of the baseline. We agree that that needs to be addressed, and we all need to start increased dialogue to address it. And that, of course, is the common starting point for environmental peace building. This narrative that we build from environmental monitoring need not be agreed upon or even shared between groups, because different indicators may align or sort of register with different stakeholder values. And that disagreement over the narrative itself can promote dialogue. So the conflict itself over what is the narrative, there's opportunity for peace building and dialogue right there. Satellite remote sensing offers some opportunities to get around some of the concerns that Amanda was mentioning about lack of access to on-site ground conditions. It offers a long-term historical, geographically expansive approach to environmental monitoring. Through integration with other kinds of data sets, it can help bridge community level observations and regional as well as even global measurements of environmental change. While satellite data are often suggested to be impartial and unbiased and objective, we know that's not true. They are not uniformly sensitive to different kinds of environmental changes, to different kinds of environments, or to different periods. We can see some things much better than others, some environmental changes much better than others using satellite data. So it's not at all a uniform treatment. And of course, the interpretation itself is also very much culturally contextualized. So we see here on the right-hand side, just an example, just thinking from the temporal perspective, we have almost a 50-year view of changes over the Dead Sea, and there are manifold changes happening here. And it's an opportunity to discuss what of these are important, what of these can we actually address. This historical record that we achieve with satellite data through constant perpetual orbiting of these systems overhead. We can think about ourselves within a sort of orbiting machine, collecting data in real time, not about individuals, but about landscapes. This has tremendous unused opportunity, tremendous unused potential in environmental peace building, since it spans regime changes, periods of armed conflict, territorial changes over time, as well as over space. We're not limited in terms of viewing areas that are otherwise off limits to on the ground access. Some concerns here is we don't necessarily know when to start the assessment. In terms of assessing a baseline condition, we need to sort of work through that in a co-production of knowledge kind of approach, in part because peace and conflict as well as environmental trends may be in process before the community recognizes their emergence, right? There's background processes that you could say are pseudo-emergent until they are obvious. So nothing happens overnight, including environmental change, including structural and symbolic conflict trends that only emerge at some point. So there's a background temporally. We need to really understand when to start this, and satellite remote sensing can help us doing that. Going back to my earlier example, we also don't necessarily know inherently when to conclude the monitoring period. Signing that peace treaty may not be an appropriate end date, especially when peace, conflict, and environmental change are occurring at different institutional scales and basically have a rollout across the landscape. So what else is challenging? One other thing that's challenging with remote sensing is we can't necessarily associate and attribute the changes we see in imagery to a community or to a environmental peace building intervention without other kinds of data on the ground. This is really essential, that these satellite data themselves don't tell us about the processes. They don't tell us about the decision making or the discussions that are ongoing. They just tell us about what's happening in process, or they can tell us about what's happening in process that as it's manifest on the ground, or the outcome of some sort of intervention at the end of the intervention. We don't know exactly the relationships between the pixels and the people. and we can make some simplistic associations spatially based on land tenure or spatial proximity, but that doesn't always play out in areas that have uncleared tenure, uncleared property, or those relationships change over time. So we really need grounded information to use these data well. Satellite data are often may not be uniformly accessible or interpretable between conflict parties either. So looking at this image on the right, you may be keying into something completely different than what I'm keying into. And you may have different access to information or experts or expertise to interpret these data. That leads to information asymmetries, that can lead to distrust, that can lead to exacerbating conflict or tension. So here again, we have this opportunity to collaboratively read imagery and interpret derived maps, another inroads for engagement and peace building. We can use this potential tension or potential disagreement, the opportunity to come to a shared assessment, shared interpretation, and use that which in the environmental peace building intervention itself, which may spill over into broader political peace. So this outsourcing that is common in national level assessments, say to the UN or to UNOCHA, groups like this, that's a missed opportunity if we sidestep the community itself and go to some outside group that then sends back their results, right? So building this assessment or interpretation up from the ground up is really has untapped potential, can offer a really nice reference point between groups. Finally, knowledge co-production around looking at environmental monitoring with satellite imagery or some other means really presents one of the biggest challenges to environmental peace building, because we're coming at a context where people don't necessarily agree, they won't share information, they lack trust, they find it too risky to be involved in a cooperative project, or they simply won't agree to be in the same room. So we need to think about how we can use some of the opportunities, some of the tensions that satellite imagery and other kinds of environmental monitoring approaches offer to work around this, to overcome some of these challenges, to achieve sustainable knowledge co-production, and really add to what we understand already from other kinds of on-the-ground understandings of environmental change through having a centralized, co-produced awareness of long-term environmental change through satellite monitoring. That's our presentation. Thank you so much, and happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much. I mean, very, very interesting and thought-provoking, and I think it was very useful that you reminded us that there is not necessarily an automatic win-win situation between peace and environment outcomes either here, and it's also useful while these remote sensing and geospatial technologies can provide you some new data and new perspectives, so they have their own risks and limitations too, and we need to also to work with the people side on the ground, so to say.
Certainly.
Okay, so let's move on to Hector, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, because it has been a really great space for conducting my research and a platform to share it, etc. So it's really great. And thank you, Sheila, for sharing the slides. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Do No Harm approach as a tool for tailoring monitoring and evaluation frameworks in environmental peacebuilding interventions next. So why is it important to have a clear theory of change for monitoring and evaluation in environmental peacebuilding? So a theory of change explains the pathway through which a project can achieve specific results, and also is a management strategy. So it helps to adjust and recreate and redesign possible changes in the context. also, it helps to understand matters of attribution and the causality of specific activities within a project, but in the long run, also whether how is the project or the activities are contributing in the long term to a project. So matters of contribution. Next. So the do no harm approach. I have to confess, this is not a super innovative method. It has been there for a long time in international development and humanitarian emergencies. It emerged as a way to address how, while implementing activities in a conflict-affected context, it can, you become a part of the conflict, and you can also affect the conflict and have unintended consequences. So the main analysis of the context that the do no harm does is to differentiate between dividers, which are sources of tension or division in a society, and connectors, which are factors that bring people and groups together, or also known as local capacities for peace. And these you do by identifying patterns, and at the end you have the opportunity to redesign into what I call here build peace opportunities, which is quite important for environmental peace building if you are working on the environment. Next. Okay, so I conducted my research in Caquetá in Colombia. So Colombia is Caquetá is the entry point of the Amazon in Colombia, and it has a wealth of natural parks. It's rich in water and biodiversity, and it has also so for decades of unsustainable land uses, coming from timber extraction, gum trees extraction, passing from gold mining, illegal crops, and after the peace agreement, as Jamon mentioned it. There is overlapping challenges. So there is the challenge of post-agreement peace building, so bringing institutions to this territory, and it's also a highly vulnerable region. And there was a power vacuum led by the guerrillas, so the deforestation rates exacerbated, and there was a start of land grabbing and extensive cattle ranching. The agricultural frontier was moving. Next. So I conducted my research in two cases. The first one is called Sustainable Land Use Systems to Stop Deforestation and Foster Peace Building. Sustainable land use systems are productive strategies that meet livelihood aspirations in ways that are sustainable whilst maintaining environmental integrity. They have a multi-scalar approach. So one, at the farm level, they sign conservation agreements with farmers in order to prevent that they enter further into the forest in a co-design process, but also they intervene at the landscape level and at the market chain level. And next. And the second one is called Protected Areas in Peace. This program aims to support and strengthen institutional capacities and open dialogue spaces to manage protected areas in Colombia, in 6 protected areas. And I'm going to talk about specifically about the case in Caquetá, where in a buffer zone of the National Park Cordillera de los Picachos, which is an ecosystem that meets the Orinoquia flatlands, the Andes, and the Amazon. There is a reservoir zone of peasants, so, which has like a certain autonomy, and also a settlement of former guerrilla group from the FARC, right? So former rebels were living there, and it was conducted a biological expedition into an area that was previously not accessible to civil society. So it was made in a group where the rebels were guiding in some territories. There was biologists, Colombian biologists and scientists, and also park rangers. So there were many actors that previously, and also farmers that were previously in the conflict area, and now they are trying to build monetary participatory community participatory. Next. So the methodology. So the first thing was to conduct a context conflict analysis next, which was to identify the root causes of the armed conflict, but also contextual socio-environmental conflicts that were present there through a participatory approach. Next. Then we made do no harm workshops with the practitioners and some key stakeholders to make an attribution analysis to know step by step the project activities, how they were implementing them, and identifying possible dividers and connectors of these activities, and then trying to bring up solutions to diminish these risk or dividers and to enhance the potential connectors that were identified. And so the theory of change and the indicators then were built through connecting what was found in the do no harm approach, which with theoretical assumptions of the interventions, prioritization of what they thought would be their impacts, the stakeholders, but also a literature review on positive peace building and environmental peace building. Next. So as a structured causes of the Colombian armed conflict, there are 4, but this could be contexted, but 4 are critical in Calcutta. So a political culture of violence, so elites that use violence to influence politics, the weakness of the Colombian state, the limits of political participation, and also socioeconomic marginalization, and unequal access to land and natural resources. Next. So the contextual socio-environmental conflicts that were identified by both projects, at the first priority, there is land, which has to do with unequal use and access, but also with irrational use of resources or deforestation. And they both find that there is a lack of territorial governance and state presence, which somehow stay out of the scope of these projects that are international development. So they have to work through the government. Next. So this is just as an example to illustrate complexity, these causal loops that Jamo was talking about. So connecting the structural causes and the contextual conflicts. Next. Yeah, so in the right corner, you can see how it looked implementing a workshop in a virtual environment. So with some visualization, virtual visualization. And so for the case of sustainable and use systems, I'm going to just highlight some of the findings. So dividers, they find that the farmers may notice that there could be exclusion. So this is something that could divide people in the region, and that the project does not address land access. So the connectors that they identify was that there was transparency when they were building the participatory design of the farms and the conservation arrangements. And one thing to diminish this divider of land access or an opportunity for peace was working with farmers coming from the program of voluntary illicit crop substitution that had access to land. So these will make like a standard for accessing the program. And next. So this was some of the indicators that came from the forest conservation agreement. So for example, one merely monitoring indicator was number of conservation agreements signed, but also they came up with or what was designed was a perceived increase of levels of trust in conservation agreements as an ex post. The assumption behind is that an agreement signed to create forest conservation, recognizing farms' livelihood priorities and designing with them the farms could enhance trust within institutions, for example, and also granting a percentage of participation of vulnerable populations, so victims of violence, poor farmers, etc. Next. And for the second case, they had this component of building information systems for the protected areas. And one divided is that there is a lack or unequal access to information, especially for women. One connector that they identified is that information is as a base for decision making, and that participatory community monitoring creates the sense of belonging to a community and builds up the premise of defending their territory, right? And one opportunity that they saw is that they can democratize information and enhance the way they negotiate with the government. For example, following probable environmental damages caused by projects implemented after the peace agreement. Next. So some of the indicators that emerged from this component in this project were, for example, again, intra-community perceived trust that increased among community members after participating in community participatory monitoring. And this has an effect on both working in the weak state presence and the limits of political participation as the structural cause of conflict. And in the contextual conflict is lack of production and access of technical information, right? And what is behind some environmental peace building mechanisms from the literature is that working together at a technical level, increase trust and cooperation, which is also known as the contact hypothesis. For example, in this case, between local park rangers and ex-rebels and farmers, right? Another indicator, for example, is cooperation between state and communities. So how many processes started after the rebels, the farmers, and the park rangers were working, and how much were they looking forward to cooperate further, right? And how you can measure this? So there can be perception services and scales, which is tricky as well because it can change in time. One small action can diminish trust at all. And just as an act, as something that I just saw because I was doing some monitoring after the expedition in December, I was doing this focus group, and there was an increase in trust between the local park rangers and the community, but the community was very much still not trusting on the national policies of the national establishment of protected areas, and there's path dependencies in the history, how these policies are made from the top down. Okay, next. So this is how a theory change can see. So you can see the contextual conflict, the action that is implemented, what mechanism or assumption is behind, and the outcome, the ideal scenario afterwards. Next. So as conclusion, what I noticed is that working with the do no harm approach, and I come from a peace building. I used to work with the do no harm approach as I was working in Colombian peace building. For sure, this helps to make an in-depth conflict analysis, complementing it with political economy analysis, a stakeholder, etc., stakeholder in relationships analysis. And it supports building this monitoring and evaluation system in environmental peace building. Also, it's essential to separate structural causes of the armed conflict and contextual emergence of socio-environmental conflicts. Why? Because some of the contextual socio-environmental conflicts may not be violent yet, but it could be prevented. And also how working in specific cases of dialogue processes can also help to this bigger conflict. Also, that the do no harm contributes to understanding these mechanisms of contributions, and if well implemented, it can lead to the refinement of strategies to build peace. And specifically in projects which objective mainly is on the environmental side. And to end, it is criticized that the do no harm is just a checkbox, and that you say, okay, we implemented a workshop to diminish risks, but it should be a process of reflection and recognition in a highly participatory manner. It should be integrated from the programming and within the whole monitoring and evaluation system. Okay, thank you. I hope I didn't get too long.
Thank you, Hector. No, not at all. I mean, you were right on time also. Very interesting and very practical and applicable research in a highly complex situation. You have a comment in the chat box from saying that this is from Camille Marquette, that she would recommend you to have a look at CDA collaborative methodologies that have been very good materials, have very good materials for M&E and peace building projects. Perhaps you are aware of this. No?
Yeah, for sure. I forgot to mention that this figure, the source is from CDA, and for sure they have a very practical approach.
Okay, thanks. Oh, sorry, I said, I've actually seen you online earlier, yesterday. Apologies for that. So let's move on to Erika, our last but not least presenter for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juha. So just sharing my screen. And okay. I appreciate the opportunity today to present a funding perspective as part of the toolkit development for monitoring and evaluation of peace building. I am the U.S. Global Hub Director for Future Earth, but in my past life, I was an executive director of the Belmont Forum, which is an international platform of funders that are supporting transnational, transdisciplinary research. And before that was at the U.S. National Science Foundation. So I come at this from this transdisciplinary perspective. And you might ask, how does that relate to environmental peace building? It is this nexus approach that brings together academic expertise from a variety of different disciplines and interdisciplinary pursuits, but together with lived experience in a co-developed and co-implemented process. So there really is a spectrum of activity here that has different levels of participatory engagement. It can run the gamut from something that is merely just place-based knowledge, all the way through sort of action-oriented informed decision-making. So the degree of integration into the design of the project can vary greatly, but we err on the side of the more inclusive, more interactive, the better, to really blend that learning into something new that could potentially transform policy and practice in an area. So I am so glad to connect with environmental peace building because of the focus of many of these activities on the Sustainable Development Goals and the recognition that it may not be possible to achieve the SDGs without peace, without SDG 16 as a cornerstone of all of this activity. I just want to point out, let's see, from a funder perspective, when we are looking at monitoring and evaluating transdisciplinary activity, there are a lot of different attitudes to this. They change by funder, they've changed over time. There are some major ministries and federal or national funders that have moved away from monitoring and evaluation, requiring only a final report from projects. That is not the way things were undertaken in the Belmont Forum, because we recognized the need for sort of a learning journey and cohort building to really increase added value. It's something that I will discuss a little bit later. But in creating an M&E program for a transnational, transdisciplinary entity, we looked at all of the different M&E types from partner funders and looked at what they required their projects to engage in within themselves, sort of that internal piece, and also what they had to externally report back to the funder. And a lot of times the metrics were just that, metrics. They were very numeric in nature. Some organizations would ask for narratives, but how those narratives were treated, how that was weighed against some of this numeric sampling was unclear. And we developed a real range of potential here, looking at from the annual to midterm, end term, whether or not skills were provided to projects at the outset of their activity to be able to, self-reflect, whether or not the monitoring information that they were providing was then reviewed by experts or, through a coordination process to provide them feedback that could help them improve or overcome challenges. And looking at whether or not we needed to specify certain deliverables, outputs, outcomes, and then recognizing that this particular process was a nested process, looking all the way from the project level up to an institutional level, and how the questions that were asked maintained consistency throughout that scaling. And then the final element of this, is Amanda mentioned in her presentation, is sometimes the long time frame of the transformation that might be expected through this interaction. And that might lead to something called post-award monitoring and evaluation, where the change is then viewed not only through the team development and through their perspectives, but also the ripple effects of what was produced. And that is often quite expensive and very rarely included in major project funding. Where it tends to be a representative sample and not all projects. So as I mentioned, it is this nest. So building blocks at the project level, recognizing that it is helpful to a project undertaking this type of work to have their own reflective process. Are my methods appropriate to the situation? Are we collecting, and monitoring information at an appropriate time frame? And what is the most effective way to solicit that information? Is it numeric? Is it imagery? Is it a narrative? And how are we treating that? And are we asking more than we actually need? Especially now with things like GDPR, we have to be very careful in how we frame surveys or how we collect information, ensuring that we are not collecting data just to collect data, but that there is an actual impetus behind it. And are there existing measures of success? How do you know when you've actually, resolved conflict, achieved peace? These are very challenging questions within this space. So just to give you an idea, the driver for a lot of the questions within a monitoring and evaluation system for a funder are related to their definitions of added value. And these really run the gamut. Sort of the traditional ones are return on investment. So actually, making profit or, leveraging investment by other organizations in this project, and showing that added value is there. Other organizations may look at the engagement of specific sectors or personnel, the advancement of women, the advancement of low middle income countries, leadership in those roles, scaling up solutions, tech transfer, enhancing capacity, increasing diversity. So to be able to tie that into your monitoring and evaluation is critically important. And when you're working in a transnational space, trying to meld that all together into an appropriate questionnaire that meets all of these different needs, because why the funder is collecting this information is to take it back to their administration to be able to further this program, to continue to have a budget line item that is providing, capital resource for this type of work. So there are generally two different categories that are solicited. One is outputs. That's really, the data that is collected, the digital objects, which can be models, it can be, journal articles, it can be data journals, it can be all kinds of things. But these are, concrete deliverables that projects are, making available, hopefully in an open access ethical way as a result of their interaction. The second part, though, is outcomes. And these are much more difficult to come at because these tend to be the narrative. And how do they, evaluate these narratives and, put them in different categories that speak back to those issues of added value. And so this is very intensive work and it can be very subjective. So it's something that still needs development in order to be more transparent so that projects have feedback of how, their work is being cataloged. A big part of it, at least within the Belmont Forum, was the recognition that working in participatory research has a lot of challenges and that there is learning along the way. I'm not sure how many of you are welcome in your reporting to express frustration, challenge, roadblocks to achieving your goals. It's definitely something that was welcome. And we saw this enhanced even more so as the pandemic came about. So mobility issues, but turning that on its head and saying that this empowered local observers and actually changed the power dynamic within a project. The digital divide actually spurred new ways of communicating using WhatsApp and other technologies to be able to continue the collaborative effort, even if it couldn't be in person. Other things employed theory, such as how to deal with negatively engaged stakeholders in a multi-stakeholder negotiation, building a joint vocabulary, even amongst scientists not sharing the same basis, recognizing that we have to ensure the safety of our stakeholders in shifting political conditions or other conflict areas, and ensuring that there is transparency and fulfillment of the project goals as best as possible. In some instances, because this is international and somewhat without the typical carrot and stick bounds that you might have with a national funder, you could have parties that do not fulfill their part of the project. And how do you handle that? So this is a key part of the learning within the project that funders do want to see to ensure that their investment can be successful in the future. And to do that, what we did with Belmont Forum and what we do with Future Earth is we create communities of practice, bringing projects together, recognizing that there is a lot of shared difficulty that might be overcome just through conversation, knowing you're not alone, knowing that there is learning that is available to you. I'm not sure how many of you at the outset of your projects had training made available to you like this monitoring and evaluation toolkit to be able to develop your own process. But that is fully integrated. So in a Belmont situation, money is not just given to a project and then the funders walk away. There's actually a very close relationship throughout with multiple touch points, developing coordination hubs and networking opportunities to be able to be stronger together. And it actually increases added value for the funders. So it's a win-win situation. And we encourage you to please come to the next Sustainability Research and Innovation Congress in Pretoria, South Africa, and online. We have an open call for session proposals where we are building that community of practice around participatory research and transdisciplinary approaches. So in just my wrap up here, the evaluation of all of this monitoring data, there is the question, is it about delivering the goals, the journey to get there, or both? How do we look at the full suite of information that is collected by a project or a cohort, tie it into the priorities of the organization, look at the challenges that they've overcome and connect it to something even greater than the funder itself, for example, like the SDGs. And this is an ongoing process. The data can be cut a number of different ways, but the point here is to show progress towards institutional goals, SDGs, conflict and peace, what have you, in a transparent way that is easily digestible, particularly for administrations that may have very short attention spans. So I just want to thank you so much for this opportunity today, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Erica. Also very interesting, and I'm sure this is very interesting to many of the participants, the perspective that you are taking. But it's, just a quick reaction is this thing really that you need this monitoring and evaluation, particularly evaluation data. You can use it for so many purposes, and one thing is to use it for the immediate project, but the other thing is to satisfy the donor's needs. But then this more important thing is also that you want to actually aggregate some of these results, and it will require some imagination also to how do you verify the results, and the whole issue of contribution and attribution comes here. Okay, so let us start the discussion, and we have about 20 minutes for it now. We have a couple of questions from the in the chat here already, and this is from Kenlia. Do you want me to read them out, or do you want to? We can give you the microphone also, Kenlia, if you so wish. I hope we can. Okay, so I can just start with these questions here, and these are to all panelists and whoever wants to respond. But first is the question of the use of mixed methods is essential to find donut holes in data. How do you see the selections of methods used being adaptable enough to meet the community needs, the researcher limitations, and the applicability to larger connections? And a second question is, given the need for adaptability, especially around community needs, values, and organization, how often are indigenous qualitative and quantitative methods used? Who would like to tackle these questions? I'm not sure I can. Yeah. So. Okay.
Thanks, you. Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. Why don't you go first, and then Erica?
So me? Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, Hector. Yes. Please.
Okay.
Yes. Sorry.
Okay. Now I think there are really relevant questions, Kenlia. So for the second one, there is a really a need for translate these cosmovisions of indigenous peoples, especially if you're talking about protecting the environment in conflict or fragile context. This is crucial. And so they have different times, they have different ways to live, different rhythms. So indeed, some other methodologies could be very valuable. For example, I don't know, through imagery, through building, for example, there was this process of theater where the communities represent conflicts, and it's a way to make different actors interact, etc. And I guess in the other one that is mixed methods, I think Jaimon also mentioned it, and I think it's crucial, for example, with all of these remote sensing GIS methodologies or GIS methodologies. You can see a lot of things with a satellite, and in some hard, difficult areas to access to, is crucial to have this satellite image. But there is also some risk, no? And when I was there in Calcutta, the community was also saying this is super good that we are doing some capacity building, or that we're forming ourselves to do monitoring of biodiversity. So they knew some of the names of the animals in a popular way, so to say, or like a more customary way, and they were learning the scientific names, etc. But they also say here, if you talk about monitoring in a conflict affected area, it could be also doing intelligence for military purposes. So this is some of the risks that you face, and where you have to really be careful of what are you going to do with the information, the transparency, and how is this going to be purposefully integrated into the visions that the communities have, and how to reconcile, I don't know, global visions of stopping deforestation, but also the needs of the communities to survive in the border of a protected area, for example.
Thanks very much. I'm pleased to see a young peace builder in the screen with Jaimon and Laura here. Erika, do you want to come in?
Thanks so much, Juha. So yes, I'm speaking to the second question more than the first. Just recognizing that Indigenous peoples have just as much diversity as all other peoples, and Indigenous peoples of the North are very involved in the data collection, particularly since a lot of the work takes place on their sovereign territory. They have developed their own monitoring systems for things like ice and wildlife in Inuktitut and other languages. And they collect their own data, and they've made it available through a database called Iloka, which is actually narratives and traditional stories that is available. It is an open database, but you just have to tell them what you're doing with it, and then they grant access to it. So I think the qualitative and quantitative methods really vary depending on the region that you're working with and the level of engagement that you have involved. So.
In the meantime, so Jill Baggerman has in the chat has highlighted the most significant change methodology as one that is also using storytelling and so on. Laura? Jen, yeah.
Hi there. We just wanted to pop in, I think that this is such a fascinating question about adaptability and how do you use monitoring and evaluation that's, responds to community needs, interests, values, and goals. And I think where it gets really interesting to me is in trying to think about issues of scale. And so when we're trying to look at an environmental peacebuilding intervention and at issues that are happening and playing out at a local scale within a community, then I think that there's a little more space to be able to be, very responsive to community needs, and especially where those communities are geographically bound in a specific location and not communities that are connected through interests that might transcend geographical boundaries. But when we start to think about these communities that are connected across geographies or across or more diffuse, or when we're looking at interactions between scales, or even at higher institutional scales like the national or state scale, it starts to get a little more complicated, and especially where we see interests and needs and values in conflict with each other. And so I think that I don't have an answer to that, to how to actually deal with that necessarily, but I think it's something that's really important to think about, as a lot of our work is centered in places that are affected by conflict and conflicts of interest, and how to take those conflicts and try to use them constructively to come up with even better methods for monitoring and evaluation. That's what I would have to say about that. I don't know if you had anything to add, Jamin.
Yeah, that was good.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Participants, okay, so if you can either raise your hand electronically here, I'm trying to monitor the screen, or put your name into the chat if you have some comments. We are about 40 people online, so I'm trying to see around here. In the meantime, one of the things that crossed my mind, especially based on the timelines that both Amanda and Erika have mentioned here, is that monitoring and evaluation is so often funded through the projects that we are dealing with, and which means usually then that the M&E budget is also ending together with the project. So that poses certain limitations on how are we able to address evaluations, ex-post evaluations especially. And that's a practical challenge. And I'm personally very lucky to work in an organization where we have an internal independent evaluation function, so we can go to look at projects or sets of projects afterwards anytime, but often that is not the case. Just an observation. Yeah, so I see Eric Abitbol. Please, Eric, do you want to? Yeah, great.
Sure, yeah, I'll happily jump in. Thanks.
To do that, you'll need to be online.
Sorry. Okay.
Sorry.
No worries. So, I mean, a lot of the discussion, fascinating, really enjoying this. So thank you for putting together this panel and also reading the comments in the chat. I think just even following on from something that you just said, Juha, and drawing on some of the very challenging comments that, that Jamin made also about the kind of non-linearity and inevitable connection between kind of peace and environmental sustainability. More and more I'm seeing that people that we're working with, the organizations, donors, and others are asking not only to understand what kind of contribution we're seeing from initiatives, interventions, but also for us to assess systems change and putting together methodologies, approaches, processes that will allow us to look at, not only the organizations, not only the interventions of those organizations or groups, but how can we, recognize and assess progress being made in systemic transformation. And for that to become a part of the conversation and for us to move a little bit away from this kind of interventionist logic to, assessing kind of wider systemic change and complexity and dynamics, because we're not really looking at, we can take a snapshot, but, from one month to the next in the Horn of Africa, things can be very different. From 1 year to the next in the Middle East, things can not move at all at one level, but we're seeing very grassroots kind of progress being made, as also was raised in one of the presentations. So I just wonder if there are those, on the call who also have further insights on some of the methodological approaches and challenges associated with, you know, this shift in looking away and moving to include not just interventionist logics and you know, immediate impacts, if you will, but towards systemic change and how to integrate that methodologically into the way in which we're having these discussions. So yeah, any, you know, just putting that on the table, because I don't know that we're, you know, I would think that's an important part of the discussion, and we touch on it and we hear it and it's a little bit there, but to bring it a little bit more coherently together into the discussion. Thank you.
It's an excellent point, which we, for example, the GEF, of course, struggle with always. How do we move beyond evaluating individual interventions and seeing how they, you know, lead to transformational change and what the contributions are and so on.
Can I even just say something just to, even about the Jeff, and then I'll sort of step back and maybe other people have something to say.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the whole idea of, you know, I mean, you know, the impact programs, building on the integrated, you know, approaches, et cetera. I mean, that's part of it, right? It's such an important part of the, you know, the supply chains, the, you know, the multiplicity of actors and how to bring together evaluative approaches that can acknowledge all that. And I think the Jeff's doing a lot of work around this, very interesting. And it would be great even to have a, you know, a session on the sort of successes and challenges that you've faced with the independent unit. But anyway, thank you for that. And we draw inspiration from that, but I'd love to hear from others too.
Yeah, and I see that Hector has his hand up.
Yes, no, I think this is really, really needed, and it's a call of attention to donors to integrate this, because so these two projects that I worked on, they complement each other super good, but they actually don't talk at all. So because yeah, a little bit of difference in the times that they were implementing, and they come from the same donor. So what you mentioned, that they have some direct impacts in different aspects and also regions, etc. But they both are thinking, are thinking, how are we really contributing to changing the situation? So if you see the news in Colombia, more and more deforestation, the first or the second place in killing of environmental defenders, but there are so many interventions in small projects, successful projects on the ground in different territories and regions. So this is a call of how to integrate and coordinate more. So it's always this multi-stakeholder dialogue buzzword, but to actually encourage this is super interesting and super, like, to encourage to talk more, to share lessons learned, also failures, etc. I think this is really needed in monitoring and evaluation.
Thanks. Anybody else wants to react to this challenge that Eric put out? We have about 3-4 minutes. Yeah, Erica, please.
I put some of my comments in the chat, but I just wanted to respond to Hector's message there. Yes, corralling funding cats is challenging, and aligning things is challenging because there's a lot of bureaucracy and flow involved in that. And that's why groups like the Belmont Forum, you know, they've been successful at bringing together funders around a shared area of interest, because a lot of the priorities around participatory science in general, resonate around the world. You know, there's sort of main pillars of competitiveness and security and things like that, but drilling down even further, you know, things like food security, freshwater security, you know, it's just sort of quality of life and trying to ensure that for generations to come. So by providing a platform where they can come together in a way that they can follow their own bureaucracies, but just sort of synchronize the investment is a way that we're able to accomplish more than we can on our own. If you try to impose a new set of rules on a funder, it's not going to work. The amount of red tape that you have to cut through is just incredible. So I'm not at all surprised. I smiled a little bit when you said, that they were just out of step from one another. That will continue to happen, but where possible, creating that envelope together, recognizing that they each have a part to play in these very complex, sometimes multi-decadal, systemic studies and interactions. We're trying to build those trust relationships the same way you're trying to build a trust relationship with in a multi-stakeholder negotiation. We're doing the same thing, just with funders.
Thanks very much. We are just about out of time here, so I'd like to ask whether if there's no particular questions or comments from the audience, so whether the panelists have any last words, famous or otherwise. If not, so I'm not going to try to summarize this by any means. I just think that this has been a very, very interesting and rich discussion, and there are some issues that obviously come to mind that we have to deal with, and one is this long-term contributions to a lasting change, and how addressing actually the root causes and drivers of these both issues of peace and environment, and as was stated earlier, that they are not necessarily always win-win situations either. And how do we measure these? And we need both quantitative and qualitative methods, and we need to satisfy numerous needs, and so mixed methods should appear to be the key word, and we have to make sure that we hear all the voices of all participants and all claim holders here. Anyway, so that's all I'm going to be able to say about this whole discussion, and I hope that we will all be continuing this discussion later and create new networks and create new partnerships through this conference also. So thank you very much for your participation, and to the presenters and to everybody online. It's been an enriching experience for me, at least. So stay well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.